Death in Solitary. The Tragedy of Layleen Polanco voiceover recording script. She was 27 years old. She had epilepsy. She was alone in a 6-by-8-foot cell. And according to surveillance footage reviewed by city investigators, while she lay on the floor of that cell, seizing, the correction officers assigned to watch her laughed. In this documentary, you will learn exactly what happened to Layleen Polanco inside the Rose M. Singer Center, and you will learn why it was allowed to happen. Not because of one bad officer, not because of one broken rule, because of a system that treated solitary confinement as a management tool, and a young woman's documented medical condition as an afterthought. This is not just her story. This is a story about what American jails do to the people no one is watching. By the end of this documentary, one question will still be sitting with you. Layleen Polanco was not a convicted criminal. She had not been sentenced to prison. She was sitting in a jail cell because she could not pay $500 in bail. $500. And we're going to trace, step by step, exactly how that one number led to her death. Rikers Island sits in the East River between Queens and the Bronx. It covers approximately 400 acres. At its peak population, it held close to 15,000 people at a time. It is not a prison. That distinction matters. A prison holds people who have been convicted and sentenced. A jail holds people who are waiting for trial, waiting for arraignment, waiting because they cannot afford to post bail. According to data from a New York City Board of Correction, the average daily population at Rikers in 2019 was approximately 5,700 people. The majority of them had not been convicted. The Rose M. Singer Center, known informally as Rosie's, is Rikers Women's Jail. It houses women awaiting trial, women serving short sentences, and, critically, it houses a punitive segregation unit. Solitary confinement. The New York City Department of Correction had been under scrutiny over its solitary confinement practices for years before June 2019. A 2015 Board of Correction report documented that people held in punitive segregation at Rikers face serious and documented risks, including inadequate medical monitoring, inadequate mental health checks, and extended periods of isolation that violated the city's own rules. According to that report, the DOC's own guidelines required welfare checks at specified intervals. Those guidelines existed on paper. What happened in practice was different. The Human Rights Watch had documented cases at Rikers as early as 2014 describing people with serious medical conditions placed in punitive segregation, where the ability to summon help was severely limited, where response times were slow, and where the isolation itself created conditions in which a medical emergency could become a death sentence before anyone arrived. Layleen Polanco arrived at Rikers Island in April 2019. She would be dead in less than 2 months. But before we get to what happened inside that cell, you need to understand exactly why she was on Rikers Island in the first place. Because that part of the story is where the system's failures begin. If you're the kind of person who obsesses over the psychological details of cases like this, the stuff the news leaves out, you're in the right place. We dig deeper than the headlines here. Subscribe to join the investigation. Now, let's go back to where this begins. Layleen Stravaganza Cubilette Polanco was a 27-year-old Afro-Latina transgender woman from the Bronx. She was a member of the House of Stravaganza, one of New York City's oldest and most prominent ballroom community houses. According to people who knew her, she was vivid, generous, and deeply connected to her community. That is not sentimentality. It is relevant context because the system that processed her treated none of those details as meaningful. In April 2019, Layleen appeared in a Bronx court on charges including misdemeanor assault and a charge related to a prior case. The judge set bail, $500. According to court records and reporting by the New York Times and The Intercept, Layleen could not pay it. She did not have $500 available. She was not a flight risk. She was not deemed dangerous by any risk assessment. She could not pay. The cash bail system in New York State in 2019, the year Layleen died, operated on a simple and brutal logic. If you had money, you went home. If you didn't, you waited in a cage. The New York City Criminal Justice Agency's own data showed that in 2019, A significant portion of people detained on Rikers Island were held on bail amounts under $1,000. Layleen was transferred to Rikers. She was processed into the Rose M. Singer Center. At intake, her medical history was documented. Court filings and the subsequent Department of Investigation report confirm that Layleen's epilepsy, a serious, documented, potentially fatal seizure disorder, was recorded in her file at the time of booking. The jail knew. That fact becomes critical, because what happens next depends entirely on whether the people responsible for Layleen's safety acted on that information. The evidence suggests they did not. But to understand how we got to June 7th, you need to understand one more piece of this: how Layleen ended up in solitary confinement in the first place. According to the New York City Department of Investigation's 2019 report on Layleen Polanco's death, she was placed in the Rose M. Singer Center's Punitive Segregation Unit after an altercation. The altercation? She allegedly threw a cup of water at a correction officer. That is not confirmed by Layleen. She cannot confirm anything. But according to the DOI's findings, that was the basis for placing a 27-year-old woman with a documented seizure disorder, a woman who had not been convicted of any crime, into an isolation cell. To understand what solitary confinement actually does to a human body, not philosophically but medically, you need to understand what it is. At Rikers Island's Punitive Segregation Unit, inmates were confined to their cells for up to 23 hours per day. According to New York City Board of Correction records and the 2015 and 2019 monitoring reports, this meant 23 hours alone in a cell roughly 6 by 8 feet. No programming. Limited human contact. Meals slid through a slot. The psychological and medical research on solitary confinement is not ambiguous. It is not contested. According to the American Civil Liberties Union and peer-reviewed studies cited in federal litigation as far back as 2014, solitary confinement dramatically worsens pre-existing mental health conditions, creates new psychiatric symptoms even in individuals with no prior history, and for people with neurological conditions, including epilepsy. Isolation removes the primary safety net. Another human being who can observe a seizure and call for help. Epileptic seizures do not announce themselves. They can occur without warning. During a tonic-clonic seizure, the type associated with serious neurological events, a person can lose consciousness, fall, stop breathing adequately, and be unresponsive for minutes at a time. If someone is watching, that failure has a name. And by June 2019, that failure had a documented pattern at Rikers Island. The New York City Board of Correction is the independent oversight body for the city's jails. For years, its monitoring staff had flagged specific, documented problems with welfare checks in the punitive segregation units. In report after report, 2015, 2016, 2017, the board documented that correction officers were not conducting welfare checks at the required intervals. Officers were signing off on checks that, according to surveillance footage reviewed by inspectors, they had not actually performed. Investigators gave this practice a name: ghost checks. An officer walks down the corridor, marks the log as complete, and keeps moving without actually stopping to look through the window. The documentation of this practice predates Layleen Polanco's death by years. This is the system that Layleen entered on the day she was placed in punitive segregation. A system where the people responsible for watching her had, in documented cases, been doing something else entirely. In a general population cell block, a medical emergency draws immediate attention. Other inmates shout. Someone hears. Staff respond. In punitive segregation, that mechanism does not exist. Your only lifeline is the officer assigned to the unit, and their only tool is a walk down the corridor and a look through a scratched rectangular window. According to the NYC Department of Investigation's report on Layleen's death, the welfare check system was supposed to function at specific intervals. Officers were required to log each check. The DOI found that on June 7, 2019, those checks did not happen as required. The New York City Department of Correction had rules, on paper, about placing medically vulnerable people in solitary confinement. The Board of Corrections' 2015 minimum standards specifically addressed medical contraindications for punitive segregation. Those rules required that medical staff review placements. According to the DOI's investigation, questions remained about the adequacy of medical review in Layleen's placement decision. The DOI report noted that the process of placing someone with a documented serious medical condition like epilepsy into punitive segregation should have triggered additional medical scrutiny. What the evidence shows is this. Layleen had epilepsy. That fact was in her file. She was placed in punitive segregation anyway. And then something went wrong on the afternoon of June 7th. One of the most significant pieces of evidence in this case is also the most damning. Rikers Island has extensive surveillance camera coverage. On June 7th, 2019, those cameras were recording. According to the NYC Department of Investigation's 2019 report and subsequent reporting by the New York Times, The Intercept, and NBC New York, which reviewed the footage or were briefed on its contents, the surveillance video showed correction officers at the Rose M. Singer Center's punitive segregation unit checking on Layleen's cell. The footage showed something that investigators and Layleen's family's attorneys described in public statements and legal filings as officers outside her cell, laughing, not calling for medical help, laughing. The medical examiner determined that Layleen Polanco died of a seizure. The cause of death was not violence. It was not suicide. It was an epileptic seizure, a medical event for which she had a documented diagnosis, in a cell where, according to investigators, the people responsible for watching her were not doing their jobs. Layleen Polanco was found unresponsive in her cell on the afternoon of June 7th, 2019. She was 27 years old, and she was alone. In the weeks and months after Layleen's death, 3 separate government bodies launched investigations. The New York City Department of Investigation, the Bronx District Attorney's Office, and the New York City Department of Corrections' own internal review. Each of those investigations produced findings. None of them produced criminal charges. The Department of Investigation's findings, released publicly, were specific and damning. DOI investigators found that correction officers assigned to the punitive segregation unit at the Rose M. Singer Center had failed to conduct required welfare checks on Layleen in the period leading up to her death. The report found that officers had logged checks that the surveillance footage indicated had not occurred as documented. It found that the response to Layleen's medical emergency was delayed. The DOI report recommended disciplinary action against multiple officers and supervisors. The Bronx District Attorney's Office, after reviewing the evidence, including the surveillance footage, declined to bring criminal charges. The DA's office determined that the legal threshold for criminal prosecution had not been met. This outcome enraged Layleen's family, her legal team, and advocacy organizations including the ACLU of New York, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, and Lambda Legal, all of which filed or supported legal actions on her behalf. The question those organizations raised was not whether individual officers had been negligent. The DOI's own findings confirmed they had. The question was, why does the system allow a person with epilepsy to be placed in a cell alone, with no continuous monitoring, in a unit where officers have been documented falsifying welfare check logs for years, and face no criminal consequences when that person dies? I'm currently tracking 3 other cases with this exact same pattern of negligence, involving jail oversight failures and correction officer accountability. I'll be releasing those investigations next week. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss those updates. You won't believe how deep this goes. Now, back to what the system did after it acknowledged its own failures. In 2021, New York City settled a civil lawsuit brought by Layleen Polanco's estate and family. The settlement amount, $5.9 million. The city admitted no wrongdoing in the settlement. That legal outcome tells you something precise about how American municipal governments calculate risk. The city's lawyers looked at the evidence, the surveillance footage, the DOI report, the documented pattern of falsified welfare checks, the documented knowledge of Layleen's epilepsy, and they determined that going to trial carried a higher financial risk than paying $5.9 million to make the case go away. That is not a statement of guilt. It is a statement of probability. And it tells you exactly what the city's own legal team thought a jury would conclude if they watched that surveillance footage. Layleen's sister, Melania Brown, became one of the most visible advocates for justice in this case. In media interviews and public statements, she described watching the surveillance footage and what it showed about how her sister's final hours were treated by the people responsible for her safety. According to reporting by The Intercept, which covered Melania Brown's public statements extensively, she described the footage as showing officers who appear to treat her sister's situation without urgency. Melania Brown did not stop at the settlement. She continued to appear before the New York City Council. She continued to push for legislative reform. And that advocacy, combined with the work of legislative change. Layleen Polanco's case was not an isolated incident. That is not rhetoric. It is documented in the public record. The New York City Board of Corrections monitoring reports from 2015 through 2019 identified multiple cases in which people in punitive segregation at Rikers Island experienced medical emergencies where the response was inadequate. According to the board's own publications, they documented problems with medical coverage in punitive segregation units, problems with welfare check compliance, and problems with the adequacy of documentation when incidents occurred. In a separate documented case, reported by the city and ProPublica, a man held in solitary at Rikers in 2018 reported that his requests for medical assistance went unanswered for an extended period during a medical episode. According to his account, documented in a complaint filed with the Board of Correction, officers he called did not respond in the time frame required under DOC rules. In another case documented in litigation, a person with a mental health condition held in punitive segregation at Rikers described weeks in isolation without the mental health check-ins required under New York City's own minimum standards. This is the pattern. Not one rogue officer. Not one bad shift. A structure. A set of rules that existed on paper and were routinely not followed on the floor. That made Layleen Polanco's death statistically likely long before she ever set foot on Rikers Island. There is a dimension of Layleen Polanco's case that cannot be separated from the broader facts, and it is documented extensively in legal filings and civil rights reports. Layleen was a transgender woman. In 2019, New York City's official policy housed transgender women at Rikers Island based on their gender identity when they requested it, meaning Layleen was held at the women's facility, the Rose M. Singer Center. That policy represented a formal acknowledgement. But advocates, including Lambda Legal and the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, documented, through client testimony, legal filings, and investigative reports, that the reality inside Rikers for transgender women was frequently different from the stated policy. According to a report by the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, transgender women held at Rikers describe harassment, inadequate access to gender-affirming health care, and placement in isolation, sometimes under the guise of protective custody, that isolated them from general population and from support structures. The National Center for Transgender Equality's data, cited in multiple legal briefs from this period, showed that transgender people in jails and prisons faced significantly higher rates of sexual assault, harassment, and solitary confinement than the general incarcerated population. Solitary confinement, which is documented by the United Nations as potentially constituting cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment when applied for more than 15 consecutive days, was being used on one of the most vulnerable populations inside Rikers Island. For Layleen Polanco, the intersection was specific and deadly. She was a transgender woman with a serious medical condition, epilepsy, placed in solitary confinement in a unit where welfare checks were being falsified and where a seizure meant being alone on the floor of a cell with no one watching. That is not speculation. That is what the documents show. The most contested aspect of this case, legally, politically, and in terms of public record, is not whether Layleen died. She died. The medical examiner confirmed it. The most contested question is, what did the officers see? When did they see it? And what did they do? The DOI's report was specific. Officers assigned to the unit failed to conduct required welfare checks. The footage showed officers outside Layleen's cell who, according to the DOI's findings and the accounts of investigators who reviewed the tape, did not respond with urgency when they looked through the window. The Bronx DA's office reviewed all of this. They reviewed the footage. They reviewed the logs. They reviewed the DOI's findings. And they declined to prosecute. Their reasoning, communicated publicly, centered on the evidentiary threshold for criminal negligence or criminally negligent homicide under New York state law. The DA's office concluded that while the officers Layleen's family's attorneys and advocacy organizations disputed this characterization. In public statements and legal briefs, they argued that the documented falsification of welfare check logs, an officer logging a check that the footage showed had not occurred, met any reasonable standard for criminal negligence. The debate about that legal question is ongoing. But the outcome, as of the time of this documentary, is documented and final. No criminal charges. Following the DOI's findings, the New York City Department of Correction moved forward with administrative disciplinary proceedings against multiple officers involved. According to reporting by the New York Times and the city, disciplinary charges were filed against several officers connected to the events of June 7, 2019. Administrative discipline in the New York City Department of Correction operates under the city's civil service rules. It can result in termination, suspension, or a fine, but it carries no criminal record, no incarceration, and no consequence outside the employment relationship. For context, this is the same system that had been documenting welfare check failures for years, and the same system in which, according to the DOI's findings, multiple officers had been falsifying check logs in the period leading up to Layleen's death. The DOI recommended termination for certain officers. Whether all recommended terminations were carried out and the precise outcomes of individual disciplinary cases was not fully disclosed publicly at the time of this investigation's writing. This opacity, the fact that the public cannot know the full outcomes of officer discipline in cases like Layleen's, is itself one of the systemic issues that advocates have documented and challenged in court. Layleen Polanco's death became a specific catalyst for political action in New York City. Mayor Bill de Blasio's administration had already been under pressure over conditions at Rikers. Federal oversight had been in place since a 2015 consent decree over violence and abuse at the facility. By 2019, that federal oversight was still active. Layleen's death intensified a debate that was already happening, whether Rikers Island should be closed entirely. By 2019, the New York City Council had already passed a plan to close Rikers Island over a 10-year period, replacing it with 4 smaller borough-based jails. That plan had been controversial and contested. In the aftermath of Layleen's death, advocates argued that the closure plan was moving too slowly and that the systemic failures that killed Layleen were evidence that reform within the existing Rikers system was insufficient. The debate over that timeline continues to this day. What is not debated, the conditions that existed in the Rose M. Singer Center's Punitive Segregation Unit on June 7, 2019. Those conditions are documented. They killed Layleen Polanco. Here is what the evidence record shows, assembled from the DOI report, the Board of Corrections monitoring findings, and the litigation record. 1. Layleen Polanco's epilepsy was documented at intake. 2. She was placed in punitive segregation, the most isolated unit in the Rose M. Singer Center, following a minor disciplinary infraction. 3. The Board of Correction had documented welfare check failures in punitive segregation units at Rikers Island for years before her death. 4. On June 7, 2019, officers failed to conduct required welfare checks. 5. Surveillance footage showed officers outside her cell who, according to investigators, did not respond with appropriate urgency. 6. Layleen Polanco died of a seizure in her cell. 7. No criminal charges were filed. 8. The city paid her family $5.9 million. 9. It admitted no wrongdoing. These are not allegations. These are documented facts from official sources. The question this documentary leaves you with is not whether these facts are real. The question is, what kind of system produces this sequence of documented facts? And what does it take to change it? In 2021, in direct response to Layleen Polanco's death and the advocacy of her family and allied organizations. The New York City Council passed a package of legislation that included new requirements for solitary confinement practices in city jails. New York State's Halt Solitary Confinement Act, signed into law in 2021, was the most significant reform of solitary confinement practices in New York State history. It limited solitary confinement to 15 consecutive days, consistent with international standards, and banned its use entirely for people with serious mental illness, pregnant individuals, and young people under 22. Layleen Polanco was 27 years old and had documented epilepsy, a serious medical condition. Under the HALT Act, which passed 2 years after her death, her placement in punitive segregation would have required additional scrutiny. The HALT Act came 2 years too late for Layleen. Melania Brown, Layleen's sister, testified before the New York City Council and spoke publicly on multiple occasions about her sister's case. In testimony documented in council records and reporting by The Intercept, she described the experience of watching the surveillance footage. She described the specific documented horror of watching footage that showed what the officers did or did not do while her sister was dying. What Melania Brown's sustained advocacy represents, alongside the work of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, Lambda Legal, the ACLU of New York, and dozens of community organizations, is the only accountability mechanism that actually functioned in this case. Not the criminal justice system, not the disciplinary system, not the civil courts, which settled without admission. The people who knew Layleen, the people who refused to let the case become a file in a drawer. Layleen Polanco died because of a seizure, but she died in a cell because she owed $500. She died alone because she was placed in solitary confinement for an alleged infraction that corrections officials determined warranted 23 hours a day in isolation. She died without help in time because officers assigned to watch her did not do what the rules required. And she died without. The New York Halt Solitary Confinement Act represents real progress. The ongoing federal oversight of Rikers Island, which has been extended and intensified since 2021 due to continued violence and deaths, represents pressure. But as of the production of this documentary, Rikers Island is still open. The HALT Act's implementation has faced documented resistance from the DOC, and cash bail, reformed significantly in New York State through legislation passed in 2019 and subsequently amended, remains a mechanism through which people without financial resources are detained before trial, while those with money walk free. Layleen Polanco did not die in a vacuum. She died at the intersection of 4 documented systemic failures. And the honest accounting of this case requires acknowledging that those systems are still functioning, in modified forms, right now. This case exposes a flaw in the solitary confinement and pretrial detention system that is actually